Yay, book club. And we can do introductions at the end. So when we all start talking, because people tend to sort of trickle in because it's a low tent. So Rachel, do you want to just take it to go? And if people have questions while she's presenting, you can either come off your mic and chat, or you can put stuff in the chat box, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, and Heather, I actually have a lot of questions throughout, so I was hoping that people would be ready to share. I think most of us do work together at the VA, and let me just see if I can get this share screen starting the way I wanted to. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And did it start recording already? I didn't see it say that.
Yeah, it should be.
Okay. Great, thank you. Well then, delete everything that happened and start it here. So, hi, I'm Rachel. I work at the VA in Denver, and I am going to be sharing about Chapter 10 today, which is leveraging relational analytics to create positive change, which is kind of their overview of what the actual process looks like if you're going to use relational coordination in your work. And so they laid out the chapter with these 6 different steps, which were exploring the context, creating a change team, assessing the current relational coordination, reflection and sense making, design and implement interventions, and then assess and refine interventions. And this is not necessarily always linear, and you can move about the circle over time. But what I'd like to do is kind of ground us in the project that several of us who are on this call work on, which is called the Quadruple Aim Query. And we are using relational coordination as an intervention to help with implementation of a number of evidence-based practices. So the Quadruple Aim Query is looking at improving the clinician experience, the patient outcomes, the patient experience, and the cost of care through these 3 different interventions that I'll show you on the next slide. And it's using relational facilitation as an implementation strategy to help the sites that it's working with implement these 3 interventions. Oh, I didn't know it was going to do that. Sorry about that. So the 3 interventions are the Transitions Nurse Program, which is looking at implementing skilled home health care, the Community Care Opioid Safety Initiative, which is improving access to medication treatment for opioid use disorder, and then Care Coordination Management is that last one there, which is about providing care coordination and integrated case management. And our team is working with multiple sites across the country to implement each of these evidence-based practices. And I know this is kind of complicated, and for those of you who are less familiar with this, are there any questions or any context that anyone from the team wants to add before I go forward?
I mean, I will just say, looking at this on paper, none of them seem very related. But you can use the same implementation strategies. Relational coordination applies across them.
Yes.
That's crazy.
They're all related to care coordination, even though they have different target populations and the different approach. And I don't think now Joe's is accurate anymore.
Did they change the name again?
Well, no, I don't know if they did, but they're doing a whole different model, and I don't know if it's I don't know how they're calling it or approaching it, but they basically are going to be using a veteran coach and navigator kind of person. So I don't know if it's, I mean, it's still around opioid, but it's going to be totally different.
Yeah. And for those who aren't aware, or anybody listening to the recording, Kathy is the PI for the overall project here. So thanks for that, Kathy. So then going back to leveraging relational analytics. So the first step that they talked about in the chapter was exploring the context. And that has to do with reflecting on the current state of the work process or the problem that the group's trying to solve. So in the quadruple aim query, what that means is each of those 3 interventions, looking at what is already happening or planned to happen to do each of those 3 things. So the sites that we're working with are doing one of each of those. It's not every site is doing all 3. It's all different sites doing different things. So it's pretty complex. And the work process is a process that the team is working on together. That language was a little different for me when I first started learning about relational coordination. And then the charge to get started with this exploring the context, it can come from any number of places. It might come from outside of the organization. In the book, they talked about an accreditation body or a funder might be asking sites to use relational coordination. In the case of the quadruple aim query, we are an outside implementation team, so we're also coming from outside the organization as well. But it also can come from inside. So the top management might say that they want to try using relational coordination. It might be the managers who are very close to the work, or it might even be frontline workers. And then with the quadruple aim query team coming in from outside, we're running up against some challenges in terms of understanding who is involved in the work process. And I think Heidi and Bree were both on the call. If either of you want to add any other challenges that you think kind of stem from the fact that we're coming from the outside to do relational coordination.
I think one of the biggest challenge on being like an outside person is just knowing who fills the roles in the programs that we're implementing. Like, I know when we've done it before, like in the Denver VA, it was like I knew everybody who needed to be a part of the survey, and so I just gave all of those names to someone on our team, and it was super easy to do the survey. Whereas now, we don't even know who all is interacting with our key contacts, and they're also struggling. Well, for various unknown reasons, they aren't giving us names either. So that's been a barrier that I'm sure quite a few of you have heard me gripe about.
Yeah. And is it Toy? Is that your name? Am I saying it correctly?
Yes, Twee.
Twee, have you ever done relational coordination before on a project or used it in your work?
This is all new for me. One of our network directors had sat in on a presentation you gave to Vision 8. So she shared the PowerPoint with me. I work as an OD psychologist here in Vision 8, so I wanted to learn more and see how we can support the effort as well as look at how we can disseminate this model.
Great. Yeah, so if you were to use it, it sounds like you would be coming from the inside, right, and using it with your colleagues. And I think there are other challenges that come along with that too. Like if you are coming from the inside, there may already be existing relationships that you have to navigate, and sometimes coming from the outside when you're unaware of the politics, it's easier to be a neutral party, but coming from inside, sometimes that can be a challenge.
Yeah. And my role's a little tricky because like there are some Vision 8 network groups where I have been doing a lot of team development with them. So that would be where I would be coming from the inside. And then there's a lot of work groups across the different facilities where I would kind of be the outside person because I get pulled in when there's challenges already. So I was looking at this and going, wow, this is such a nice way of trying to get these conversations to happen before,
Yeah.
be more proactive in it. Role clarification and really identifying those communication pathways.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So regardless of whether you're coming from the outside or the inside, some of the questions that they suggested to consider when you're getting started here are thinking about what are the major coordination challenges that you're facing, and making sure to keep the conversation focused on those coordination issues, not the institutional barriers, because it's fairly easy to just focus on, oh, there's this process that I have to do, and it's so cumbersome. But that's different than what we're talking about with relational coordination. We're talking about working with each other, so that's important also. But you want to try and make sure that you get at the meat of the coordination issues when you're talking about relational coordination, to make sure you're understanding that in addition to those other barriers. And then process mapping can help understand those roles of the key stakeholders. And that's something that the Quadruple Aim Query team is doing, is creating these process maps early on. They're based on conversations that we have with the teams. And then we share those process maps back with the teams to make sure the process has been captured correctly. So that documents the process and helps identify all the roles that are involved. And Bree, I know you've been doing some of that process mapping. Do you want to share anything about how that experience has been going?
Oh, sorry, I just took a bite of a Snickers bar. I guess with process mapping, initially I always understood it as, it was developed through formal interviews. It's different for me because I just work with the frontline staff, and they can literally just tell me the process of things from their side, their perspective. And it's fairly easy, but I feel like having the frontline's perspective gives those little details, especially where barriers are. I think when, leadership is asked about process and how it looks, they're going to look at the SOP or, standard ways that it should be done, but, that's never the case of sticking to that. So the process map I've made for TNP, it's pretty cool. I mean, again, it's just still a couple people's perspective, but I feel like it's more realistic than what leadership might have said.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The process might be documented, but the documented process may not be the actual process. And even if it is documented, it's still important to have those conversations and see what's happening in actuality.
Exactly.
It's funny, Bree, you make me think about, I remember when we first started doing this with the transitioners program years ago, and the feedback from staff who were like, you want my opinion? They were so honored and so much to be asked. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I don't know if times have changed, but at the time that we were digging in, they were really willing to share, and then grateful that we asked, and then even more engaged to do the work. Right. Where I think, we're really good at assuming what someone does because it's in their job description. And then we come in using an approach of, this is what you do, right? And they go, uh-huh. See, I knew that's what you did because I'm the expert, and I knew, instead of the way that you guys come in, and you come in with humble inquiry, right? Curiosity, and be like, so tell me what you do. I just think it's so beautiful, and it's so respectful of the people doing the work. I like it. Yeah, I think it's good.
And then The last question that they suggest in the book that you consider are looking at what the current outcomes are and what you want the desired outcomes to be, and thinking about those outcomes that you want to target is really helpful because it helps you focus, right? Because you can throw in every outcome under the sun, but then it's going to become your work's going to become very unmanageable because you're trying to think about all these different things. But if you focus in on one or a few related outcomes and you come to agreement on that as part of this process, then you're able to think more in a targeted way, and it doesn't get quite so overwhelming. And logic models can be helpful for thinking through those outcomes and what are you actually trying to impact, and how are you going to measure it?
I do have a question. So when we're talking about the outcomes, are we talking about more the functional outcomes in terms of if we're integrating these teams or working on this project, this is the desired outcome? Or does it also include like the communication, the relationship outcomes as well? I've never read the book, so I have it on my list.
That's fine. It is not a prerequisite to come to these calls having read the book. Heather, I think you might be able to speak to that more than I can, but with the change team, my understanding is that that's more about the outcomes that you're like the patient outcomes, and that later on with the design and implement or I guess maybe the reflection and sense making is where you're thinking more about the team outcomes. Is that your impression too, Heather?
Yeah. And I think the thing that Jody Cattell talks about is that relational coordination in and of itself is a lovely process, right? Like a lot of us just write papers that relational coordination is this, and then it improved. But ultimately, we want it to improve quality, efficiency, outcomes, safety, whatever it may be. And so the driver behind all of this should be, so for instance, with Kathy's programs, to increase care coordination, quality, safety, efficacy for high-risk veterans, and to increase employee well-being. So though we're studying relational coordination, the actual program is going to be measuring all of that. And we're hoping this is a mediator. So if we can enhance this, it helps with the outcomes.
Absolutely. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, because in order to reach that high level performance, the team actually needs to be able to be on the same page, working together, collaborating, blah, 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 to get there. Okay.
And it's
I like that mediator.
It's very concrete, right? Like, so we are going to work on frequent communication versus in the teamwork world, we just need to be better team players. And that's like, try and tell that to a bunch of, like soccer, like 7-year-old soccer players are moving around in a clump, and you're like, just do that better. And they're like, what? I mean, that's basically what we do without some really finite targets.
And I really like this model because the framework you're offering, especially if we're working with clinicians, nursing staff, providers, physicians, these are, highly skilled individuals who are very used to working autonomously, right? Or in their own world. So when we've got interdisciplinary teams, instead of letting each group kind of try to vie for that power and get pulled into those power dynamics, this gives them the framework to be able to talk about how they'll work together. So that was really what caught my attention quite a bit from the model.
Yeah. So the next step that they have in here is creating the change team, which this is a little confusing to me, right? Because you're probably doing some of this while you're exploring the context, figuring out who should be part of that team while you're figuring out what the context is, what's the current state. So if this process is not necessarily, a cycle that has to go in a certain order. You can go backwards and forwards and overlap with these. But with creating the change team, you want to be thinking about engaging multiple stakeholders. It should not be every single person. That's going to be way too big. But you should try to reflect all the roles, which is where that process mapping is really helpful to be able to have already identified what's all the roles that are already involved in this process. And then another thing that they wrote about here was making sure that the people you invite have credibility within the groups that they represent. And I think that's a place where having that internal knowledge can be really helpful rather than coming from the outside. If you already have a sense of who people really look up to and admire, then you can invite those people to your team, be a part of this this change team. And also, kind of on the flip side of that, is that they talk about how it's important to have an outside facilitator because that flattens the different power differentials. So even if you're internal and you're creating this change team, you may want to pull in someone from outside of that group to do the facilitation, because they might be able to create more of a space where it is safe to disagree and have those conversations. And one of the things that's often done at this point is relational mapping. And we have talked about this in previous book clubs, but essentially what it is kind of talking at a high level of how strong the relationships are between different roles. So what this map basically does, so this is like an example of a relational map, and the veteran is at the center, and then each of these roles on the outside are different people who are involved in this particular process, and the different colors of the lines indicate how strong the relationships are between the different groups. And this is something that's often done, well, in the old days, right, with a paper and pencil and markers and sticky paper that you would put up on walls. Now, we've done this a few times via using like a PowerPoint or a Word document where it's drawn out in advance, and then you have conversations about what the roles are, and you draw the lines and change the colors. And Heidi and Bree have done a little bit of this already, and I don't know if either of you wants to share anything about how that's been going, or tips for others that may be embarking on this process.
I'm not sure if Heidi stepped away for a second.
Okay.
Heidi really has taken hold. Oh, go ahead, Heidi.
Oh, well, I'm here. I was just honestly thinking. So so I can continue to think if you have something to say right now, Bree.
No, I was gonna wing it and think of what you might have said.
Well, I think one main thing that I have, it's just been reiterated to me is that doing the relational mapping really depends, like how well it goes depends upon the site. We've had to do it in multiple meetings, like this map that Rachel has up here. Like we weren't able to even just complete this in one meeting. We had to do it actually over the course of like 2 meetings, and that was just for determining the strengths of relationships and communications. To determine the roles, that took a lot longer. But I guess like what I try to do with, I don't know, maybe this is like a tip, but what I try to do with these maps is have like everything developed, and then just over time, as like soon as I hear somebody mention a different role, I'll add that role into the map. And so then by the time we want to actually do the relational mapping exercise with all of our sites, a lot of the roles are already filled out. So I found that to be helpful if we weren't able to pull them from the process maps. Yeah, I think the sites so far have been like fairly open and honest with us, and Heather actually gave us some really good like verbiage to use when talking about the map and explaining it to people and the purpose. So I've definitely been following kind of a little script that we developed at some point, which was really, really helpful. Yeah, so I think, I don't know, that's all I have to say for now, but if Bree or Rachel or Heather want to chime in.
One thing I thought was interesting about what you've done, and correct me if I have this memory wrong, but I think I was on a call with you where you were working on the map, and like I think it was one person who really had the knowledge to fill it out, and they were in a space where they couldn't even talk, so they were typing in the chat box, and so like you had to be really flexible with getting this information from people. And I think in projects in the past too, like, wasn't there a project in the past, Heidi, let me know if I got this wrong, where you weren't able to do relational mapping with the sites, but you kind of went through the process of thinking through what did you see as the relationship. So there are lots of different ways that it can be done if you can't actually get the people themselves to do this initial mapping.
Yeah, we're gonna try it out with because we can't have, you're supposed to have like all of the stakeholders present, and so since that's just not feasible for our programs right now, with one of the projects that we're working on, we're just gonna do it with like leadership personnel. So we're gonna be asking them, their perspectives of everything between all the different roles who are involved in the program. So we have yet to do that. So we will see how it goes.
I mean, I will say back in the day when I was, we actually would be in the same room. It was so interesting to do this because people came to consensus pretty quickly, and I was always surprised. I've done this at some workshops with medical teams, and they're role playing with each other, and so they each have, one's the housekeeper and like one's the nurse manager, and you get like, I think we had the chief of medicine at like in Boston, the Boston VA, who was the housekeeper, and he played it with vigor, man. He definitely had a theater background, but they all quickly were like, we all know we do a bad job talking, including EVS. That's a red. And it became, this was actually, I think Jody Cattell calls it like, this is the beginning. This is the theorizing of, we're coming up with a theory here, and now we just need some data to test it. And that I think is the coolest bit about this, because, yeah, we all know we do a bad job communicating with, roles, particular roles, and we all know it, but we don't know what to do about it. And we maybe need the data to show an administrator, like, we need to give these people an hour so they can come to this meeting because they're not even at the table. And then the piece that has been introduced to me recently is a veteran. Like, ideally, we want the veteran to be able to tell us how they're doing. But if we can't, because, IRB is super hard to do, at least we can all share what we think, how it is with the veteran. And I mean, I love looking at this. Like, it looks like the transition care nurse feels like she has strong relational coordination with the veteran, but then, let's see. But the social worker is saying maybe intermediate, right? So like, they thought about it. There's something different there. That's just thinking about it. What could I do better? So the mapping is much easier when you're all in a room, and I'm very sorry for that, and I hope we all can go back to it one day.
I think that doing it virtually, one of the benefits to that, it's really easy to change the colors and move things around and add roles. Whereas doing that on a piece of paper, I just imagine myself like balling it up and starting with another one. But I see people like draw circles on you might have your circles like, sorry, I'm gesturing at my screen, you can't see it. You might have your circles like this, and then have some more on the outside as you're adding roles to find ways to make that work. But as Heather was alluding to, the next piece there is to actually get that data and assess relational coordination. And this is the formal assessment of relational coordination should be offered to everybody who is involved in the work process. So your change team is probably like one or a couple people per role that's involved, but then you ideally want to offer everybody who's involved the opportunity to participate in the actual assessment of what relational coordination looks like. And this assessing relational coordination often involves the Relational Coordination Survey, which is a formal instrument. It is proprietary, right? But Heather and Bridget have a project where it's available within the VA without charge. So that is a really awesome tool that they are able to share. And so the elements on the Relational Coordination Survey are the 7 elements of relational coordination. So it's looking at communication and relationships. For communication, it's the frequency. Is it frequent, timely, accurate, and problem solving? And then the relationships is shared goals, shared knowledge, which actually means that they understand what other roles do. It's not just, book smarts or something. It's actually understanding the roles of other people, and then a mutual respect between one another. And the survey asks each respondent to rate their relationship on each of these dimensions with every role that's involved in the work process. So traditionally, if there are you get asked these 7 questions for every role, but that can get kind of cumbersome. So one of the things that we are going to be doing with this Quadruple Aim Query project is, I think, combining some of the roles so the survey doesn't get quite so big. And I've done this in the past where we had one group that answered it just in general because they were really only interacting with one other role. So we just had them answer it in general, but everybody else who participated answered for all of the roles. So you can think creatively about how you want to do the survey itself to make sure that it doesn't get too big and cumbersome. And it's specifically focused on this communication and relationships. It's not meant to capture things like how supportive the organizational culture is or what outcomes the change team should be focusing on improving. It's really just about those 7 elements of relational coordination. And then there are different ways that you can administer the survey. What Heidi is getting started with one of our sites right now is that they had a meeting where everybody who was in the meeting did the survey during the meeting. And then now the survey is going to get sent out to everybody who was not actually at that meeting, so they'll still have a chance to participate. But you can do it where everybody is in an all-staff meeting of some sort, and you do it during that time. You can do this hybrid version like Heidi's doing, where some people do it in the meeting and some people do it outside of the meeting, or you can have everybody do it outside of a meeting, which when I've done this in the past, that is what we had done. We didn't set aside time during a meeting, but it is kind of nice to do that since you have a captive audience, and it's easier to get things done that way than, put it on your to-do list and get it done later. Can be challenging. And then Heidi and Heather have been working on a process for sending out, I think, let me know if I get this wrong, but if they get an email letting them know that the survey's coming, and then they get an email with the survey, and then I think 2 follow-up reminders, and then the survey closes within 2 weeks. So it's not left open indefinitely. Anything else you all would add to that process that you're doing?
No, you nailed it. That's perfect.
Great. And one of the things I was hoping that we could spend a moment thinking about here is what are the roles that we would have the most trouble engaging, and are there any tips for how we might engage those roles in doing the survey? Heidi, I think you said that it's the frontline staff that you're having trouble getting to actually do the survey itself. So are there ways that we can better engage those people? Just generally, if anyone on the call has ideas.
I mean, I will just share in my dream world before COVID, I had this idea that we should have it on iPads. And so if you're in the clinics and you're doing work and you are chatting with someone, you'd be like, you're in this role, do you have 5 minutes to complete this survey? And then just like hand them the iPad and have them. So it's almost that real-time conversation with people who you haven't been able to provide any education about the process or maybe even the bigger project, right? But you're looking for depth. And even for people, I always think about the clinical staff who are lower down the totem pole, right? Like maybe the EVS staff, English is not their first language. Can we move it into a different, it can translate immediately to a new language, and then you hand them, and you're there to ask, we would love to have your input. Do you have any questions? And give them all the time in the world. Like that, I believe would increase inclusivity, and we would get the diversity of views that we really want. Obviously, we can't do that right now. So, how do you invite them to the table? But one day we'll be back in the hospital.
Like, are there opportunities for you all to meet with the group as a whole? Like, some of the disciplines may have like their staff meetings to be able to use that time, or like their staff huddle times to be able to say, hey, we're going to be doing this and we'd love your participation. We'll be reaching out in the next few hours or within the next few days. Or is it, are we depending on the management to disseminate and communicate the info to the staff?
That is what you did, right, Heidi? Was it a staff meeting where you had them fill it out together?
So the one where they filled it out together, it was one of our site meetings
Okay.
with the staff. And yeah, I guess I'm concerned about another program, and I'm excited. Rachel, Heather, and I have a meeting on Thursday. We're gonna brainstorm how to target the frontline providers with this, because in a program that is Kathy's program, we don't have really any contact with the frontline providers, and if we do, it's pretty minimal. So we're gonna hopefully think about like maybe different meetings that we could hop on, because we have good collaborations with leadership. And so, maybe it will be kind of a top-down thing where leadership is like, hey, these people are going to come to our meeting and we're going to do this survey. So like that could definitely be an option. But I think there's still a lot of room to explore.
Yeah, we'll have to share any ideas that we come up with, because I think it's
Yeah, 'cause
probably a common challenge.
it seems like there's that disconnect between, what management or leadership has agreed to in terms of their expectation, understanding, then how they communicate the why behind this work to the frontline staff. So if there's any way for us to kind of bridge that divide and be able to communicate the rationale with the frontline staff and the what's in it for them, right? Maybe that could help increase their engagement. Like there have been times where in some of the work that I've been pulled in to do, asking for 5 minutes in their huddle just to be able to say, hey, it's me. We're doing this. So be expecting an email from me or be expecting a phone call from me, blah, blah, blah. Any questions? And then I hop off of their huddles, just so there's at least not just this email from their manager.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think a lot of the communication is coming from Heidi, right, Heidi? So engaging the people, the champions at the site might be a really effective way to move forward. Just gonna make this quiet.
I mean, I think the work that we do, and maybe Kathy, Natalia, you can chime in, like as implementation scientists, we live in this funny place, right? Where we get, like executive, we'll get the letter of support, but we don't ever, it's not like they're paying for us. They're sort of giving us permission to do it. So Kathy, do you feel like, I mean, you were an executive in the hospitals at one point. Is this totally different than when you were an executive versus being a scientist?
Well, it is different just because, I don't know, when I was at the level of middle management that I was in, there was, not very much money for these kinds of things. So you always had to get permission and kind of explore it on your own. If it was something that the whole, administration was doing, then it pretty much was a top-down kind of a, presentation. I hope now it's, we've learned enough to know that research can't come in and just, demand these things, and that we're trying to build the relationships and get, I guess, talk about the value of doing it a little bit more and get them to spend some of their time doing it because they'll get something out of it. But maybe that's not how everyone sees it. I don't know.
That's a good point, Kathy, because a lot of times when I get brought in for just to help with the change management on initiatives, a lot of the frontline staff will say, oh, it's another flavor of the month, right? It's another thing that is happening to us. And that can reflect this level of, we haven't really sold the project to them. They see this as something that is of value to their leadership as opposed to really helping them do their work. And I think the more we can be direct and straightforward and make those connections, the more you're going to get those champions, those early adopters on the team who will then help influence their peers. So that's kind of how our teams really targeted some of our initiatives.
The other thing that I think has been huge, I mean, and I know Heidi and Bree will, can talk about this too, but they have been spending a lot of time through meetings with different stakeholders at the our sites. And, they have built up a very strong bond of trust as well, that, it took a lot of time. And also, just trying to keep it a balance so that you don't mess up what you've already, kind of put together and developed with the end sites. But I think it was Heidi who said earlier, in our previous work, we were kind of more in charge because we had either staff that we were paying for or we were doing the work. And this project is totally different because now we're working through and with other people. And so that trusting relationship that's being built, I mean, in some sites it started almost a year ago, is really just, critical to the success of our program.
So you're really consultants to that site to help them effectively implement.
Yep.
It feels like consultants without all the fancy pens and like cups and stuff, right? Like the swag, no swag.
And the fancy salaries.
Yeah, the nice suits. Yeah, we don't have that. Sorry, Rachel.
Sure. All right. Okay, so in addition to usually doing the survey, and you can use relational coordination without actually using the survey, but if you are using the survey, another thing to do at this time is to kind of revisit what the outcomes are, how they're going to be defined, and how to measure them. And like I was mentioning before, a logic model can be really helpful for that as a place to kind of document what you're expecting to happen and how you're going to actually measure it. And that it's helpful here to have just one outcome or a few related outcomes that you hone in on, as opposed to thinking of all the possible outcomes. Because what also I was alluding to with the, the kind of the cyclical nature, or you're able to jump around that circle of relational coordination, you can come back and choose other outcomes later. You don't have to say this is the be all end all of the outcomes. This is just your starting point. And within the Quadruple Aim Query project that we've been talking a little bit about, we are using, we're going to be using iterative re-aim to help sites identify those outcomes and think about what it is that they are going to measure and how those are changing over time. And then there are 3 different kind of areas of measurement, and it's recommended that groups break up and focus on these 3 different things as opposed to everybody focusing on all 3 of them. So the 3 things, the 3 broad areas of measurement that they wrote about in the book are relational coordination, organizational structures, and performance outcomes. And then for the organizational structures, you might use a tool like the organizational structure self-assessment tool. And Heather, I believe, is going to be doing a book club on that this summer. So stay tuned. And so after you've kind of done that survey, the next thing here is the reflection and sense making, and that's interpreting the results from the relational coordination survey and any other tools that you're using. And like Heather was talking about earlier, this kind of puts the elephant on the table, as they write about in the book. It's the survey results are going to offer opportunities to talk about issues that were previously pushed to the side. People probably know what the survey is going to say, and having it on paper and having the data behind it allows them to talk about it without quite as much pressure as if somebody were to just bring it up one day, like, oh, I don't think we have timely communication. It's harder to have a conversation out of the blue about that than if you've actually documented it. So they say that it puts the elephant on the table. And when you're looking at those results, this is the time to start brainstorming what issues you want to address, primarily looking at where those weak relationships are and places where your team is lacking, and thinking about different interventions that you can use. And when I say intervention here, I mean like different techniques of working together that you can use to improve those relationships. And so if you do the survey with RC Analytics, they have a lot of data that they can give back to you. And if you do the survey yourself or using the tools that Bridget and Heidi have created for the VA, you can also create lots of different tables, but it can be very overwhelming. So you want to be intentional about deciding what to share and who you're going to share it with. And one of the things that they talked about in the book is that this isn't a report card, to think about it as looking in the mirror together, and that the data is the stakeholders' data, and sharing it can be an empowering process. One quote that I pulled out of the book, I'll read to you right now, is that they were talking about the data from the survey. It is a reflection of how you felt about working together at that point in time when you completed the survey. That can change, and you can change it together. So relational coordination isn't necessarily, it's not static. It can change over time, and it can be a really empowering experience to look at it together. But one of the things that they also pointed out in the book is that the relational coordination survey was developed as a research tool. It wasn't necessarily developed as an intervention in and of itself. And so I think that's a place where what the Quadruple Aim Query is doing is a little bit novel in thinking about using relational coordination as an intervention to improve implementation. So kind of, I think, breaking some new ground there. And they stressed that the survey shouldn't be used in isolation, that it should be paired with longitudinal individual and team coaching, and a trustworthy process for relational learning and accountability and leadership development. So I know we don't have a ton of time left here, but I'd just like to take a minute to ask, does anybody have thoughts about what could go wrong when using relational coordination as an intervention, and things that we should be thinking about as we move forward?
I mean, I will share one that I think about a lot, is that if you don't have psychological safety, then everyone will just tell what they think people want them to hear, right? So then everything's going to be perfect, everything's great. But then you get that data and it sort of carves a hole in your soul. You know, you're like, but that's not how I'm working, and that's not how I'm living. And so, I mean, I always feel concerned when you engage staff who have little power, that they want to tell the truth but don't feel safe to tell the truth. But then they look at it and they go, well, this was this is just going to reinforce the status quo, and that was the nail in the coffin, and I'm out. You know, so I always have that in the back of my head. Like, you have to create the situation first. And as Kathy was saying, the trust, so that maybe people will tell you the truth. So then you can do something with it. So that's my thought.
And Heather, in your experience in what you've read and done with relational coordination, do you think that's easier to, that psychological safety is easier to achieve when you have an outside group that is kind of pushing this process along, or when it comes from the inside?
I don't know if there's one preferred method over the other. I think it's that people believe the why matters, right? Like, this is a really big why for us. We know why we're trying to do this work. And so I'm going to help provide information so that we can all make the big change versus, this is a different time, right? Everybody's burnt out. Everyone's exhausted. And so do they see a light at the end of the tunnel? We have to give them that light. So I don't care if it's a consultant or an internal person, but if we see a light, if we help them see the light, maybe they'll get on board. But if they're just like, flavor of the month, man, what do you need? I'll fill it out. Fine.
Well, and also just to piggyback on that, I was thinking about, the longitudinal nature of it. We are, for at least for right now, we're doing it more than once. And our whole idea about using facilitation, relational facilitation based on the results of the relational coordination survey, to make changes with the team and to address some of the areas where there's challenges in either the communication or the relationships. It's kind of like, if you don't really have the opportunity to hear the truth, and then you go through the motions of doing these goals and working on different things, and then, with the hopes of making a big change. And then at the end, you just repeat everything. And if it was all a farce, you're just wasted a whole lot of time and energy. So yeah. It would be not, it would be good if we could figure out a way to make sure that it is valued and people want to spend time improving their relationship with the people they're working with.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's value to call the elephants out, put them on the table, talk about the elephants. But then for the frontline staff, at the end of the day, it's so what, right? If we identify the elephants, how are we going to tackle it? And so really having that facilitated support to come up with those actions. We do a similar process on our team where we come in, interview folks to hear what's working well, what's not. They give honest feedback because there's privacy and confidentiality. And then some of those teams, the management group doesn't really invite us back to help facilitate. They're like, oh yeah, we got it from here. And then I'll get individuals reaching out to me, hey, it's been 2 months. We haven't seen any progress, or they haven't talked to us. Versus when we're involved in that facilitator role, then we're scheduling meetings. Hey, how are you guys prioritizing? What is your next step? How do you know you're gonna, who's gonna help put this together? Blah, blah, blah. And really just, again, facilitating those processes.
Yeah, and I think that's leading into this next step here of like designing and implementing those interventions. One other thing I forgot to mention with the reflection and sense making too is you have to think carefully about how much to share and with whom. That oversharing could create some tension if you're sharing information that's uncomfortable, or that maybe you have like 2 people in a role and that role had really low scores. So you want to be careful what you're sharing, but at the same time, you want to make sure to share enough information that people don't feel like, well, we already knew this. I mean, yes, they are likely already going to know a lot of what comes out in the survey, but do you want to make sure that it doesn't feel like you're holding back?
So Rachel, I hate to do this.
That level of transparency.
Sorry?
You only have 3 minutes left, so
yeah. So I'll give you these slides, Heather, to send out also, but this here, design and implement interventions. This is where you're thinking about how you can actually apply what you're learning from the results. In my notes, I say we'll spend the most of the time here, but this has been such a great discussion and really helpful. So there's this graphic here that they have, and there's a lot in this slide, but basically you want to look at where the weak ties are and think about what kinds of interventions are going to help those. So they have, they break it out into structural interventions, relational interventions, and work process interventions. So the relational interventions are the ones that have to do with relational coordination. And they had a couple quotes on here, but I'm going to just skip over this. But the main point here is that if mutual respect is low, that's the first place you want to put your energy, because if that is not, if that's not a place where the team is in sync, then nothing else is going to work. And then there's a relational intervention toolbox with a lot of different ideas. And then the work process interventions is kind of like lean and figuring out how to look at your current state, the desired state, and then how to close that gap. And then organizational structures are on the organizational level, and middle managers probably can't impact those. And then the assess and refine interventions has to do with basically sustainability and making sure to have ongoing assessment so you can continue thinking about relational coordination over time, and keep rethinking those interventions that you're using. And then also keeping in mind that positive change may have occurred in a way that isn't memorable or wasn't measured. So you can keep coming back and thinking about that. And that's it. Sorry for getting so rushed. It's just really good conversation. I appreciate that.
This is such a great introduction for me for all this. So I very much appreciate the invitation. And there's a lot of familiar aspects, but the framework and pulling these different pieces together is, for me, what's exciting to have a different model to be able to think about these different factors and drivers.
Yeah, Rachel, you did a beautiful job. You made it very intuitive. Thank you for this presentation. It's really great.
Yeah, it was fun to think through, and it helped me better understand our process. So thanks for the opportunity, Heather.
And so we have a book club every month. Next month is Bridget. Who's next month?
I think Erin's up next month.
Right. So Erin Blakeney, who's a colleague from Washington, who's done a bunch of work in this around interdisciplinary teams and rounding at the bedside. So she's going to talk about a bunch of her work and then a bunch of future work. So always more to come.
Thank you again for the invitation. I love this team science stuff. So all of this is a lot of new information. So appreciate the opportunity. I'll see you all next month.
Thank you.
It was great to have your perspective.
Yeah, it was really great.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.